The wind had a peculiar bite to it that evening in Chipping Dunbridge, one of those early autumn chills that slipped through even the thickest cardigans and made old bones ache. Inside the vicarage, however, the fire crackled merrily in the hearth, sending soft shadows dancing across the wooden beams of the drawing-room. It was the sort of cozy domestic scene one might have found on a Christmas card, if not for the tension hovering just beneath the surface. "More tea, Miss Marple?" asked Rev. John Dillingford, leaning forward to offer the pot with exaggerated reverence, as though pouring tea were a sacred rite. "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, her delicate hands wrapping around the china cup with habitual grace. "It's a charming blend. Darjeeling, I think?" "Yes, from Miss Topham's shop in Tunbridge Wells. She recommended it for calm digestion," the vicar's wife, Lydia, said with a brief, nervous laugh. "Not that any of us are particularly calm these days." Miss Marple's eyes, soft as wool yet sharper than glass, did not miss the slight tremor in Lydia's fingers as she stirred her own cup. The gathering had not been meant as a formal one, just a few villagers invited for warmth, company, and conversation as the days shortened. Besides the vicar and his wife, there was Colonel Halberd, retired and prone to loud opinions. Mrs. Edith Payne, recently returned from a curious trip abroad. Young Janet Roper, the doctor's niece, visiting for the month. And naturally Miss Marple, staying once again with her nephew Raymond while his cottage underwent drainage improvements in nearby Much Benham. At first glance, everything was quite ordinary. There was light chatter, the pleasant clink of teaspoons, and the scent of cinnamon scones. Yet an undercurrent of unease trembled beneath the firelight's glow, an intangible sense that not everyone in the room was entirely at ease. "Funny how quiet the village has been, Colonel," Halberd remarked, warming his hands near the fire. "No break-ins, no gossip, not even a misplaced bicycle. Almost too quiet, if you ask me." Lydia's hand faltered. "Well, there was that unfortunate matter with poor Letitia Blake's cat going missing. But I hardly think that counts." "Cats come and go," the colonel sniffed. "Not like people. When people disappear, that's something to worry about." Janet Roper, who had been unusually quiet for a girl with such striking eyes, glanced up. "Are you referring to Mr. Phillimore?" "Who?" Miss Marple inquired gently, setting her cup down on its saucer. "Mr. Douglas Phillimore," Lydia said hastily. "A solicitor, moved into Greystone's cottage 2 months ago. A reserved sort of man. Nobody saw much of him, really. And now he's vanished," the colonel added. "No forwarding address. No letter, no nothing. Just up and disappeared." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "How peculiar." "Went out for a walk 6 days ago," said Edith Payne, her voice low. "Left a stew simmering on the stove, a lamb stew, I believe. The postman noticed the smell on his second day around and raised the alarm. Police had to break the door." There was a silence, broken only by the pop of the firewood. "No sign of struggle?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light but her eyes steady. "None," the colonel grunted. "Everything in its place." Except? Miss Marple prompted almost absently. The colonel waved a hand. "Except there were 3 teacups on the parlor table. One had lipstick on it," Miss Marple's brow lifted. "A lady visitor, then?" "Or 2 visitors, Edith," sighed, pursing her lips. "The 3rd cup was clean, unused. Bone china, delicate handle. And no sign of him since?" Miss Marple asked. Janet Roper crossed her arms. "There was a suitcase missing, apparently. But his wallet and keys were still in the umbrella stand." "That hardly suggests a planned departure," Miss Marple murmured. "Nor the stew on the stove." "It's most likely a private affair," Lydia said quickly. "He may have had problems, financial ones or romantic." "Quite right," Edith chimed in. "Though I dare say, for someone so solitary, Mr. Phillimore seemed oddly expectant of company." Colonel Halberd gave a snort. "Expected it or got it. Either way, something's not right." A silence fell again, not the peaceful kind, but brittle and watchful. The fire had dimmed slightly, casting longer shadows now. Then, just as the vicar reached for the poker, a knock came at the front door, loud, urgent, and strangely out of place in the soft English evening. Everyone turned. Lydia stood first, clearly flustered. At this hour? Moments later, a young constable was ushered in, his uniform dusted with mist and his eyes flicking around the room, as though weighing everyone within it. "Sorry to disturb, but I was told I might find Miss Marple here." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Yes, I'm here, Constable. Has something happened?" The young man cleared his throat. "Yes, miss. I've been sent from the station at Miltonbury. There's been a discovery, a body, miss. In the woods behind Greystone's cottage." Lydia gasped. Edith dropped her spoon. The colonel muttered a curse under his breath. The constable went on, voice grim. "We believe it's Mr. Fillimore, but that's not the odd part. It's what was found next to him. A tea tray, with 3 cups. The fire in the vicarage drawing-room crackled with quiet dignity, casting long, lazy shadows across the polished wood floor and the faintly floral wallpaper which had begun to peel slightly at the edges. Outside, the sky was a fading pewter gray, streaked with the last reluctant light of a September day, and the wind danced in irregular bursts against the window panes like an impatient guest not yet invited in. Inside, however, all was warmth and well-bred civility. Tea had been poured, scones had been buttered, and polite conversation floated like a well-tuned radio between those gathered. Rev. John Dillingford, earnest as ever in his navy cardigan and mismatched socks, was holding forth on the need to repair the church bell tower, though it was clear few were listening closely. Miss Marple, seated near the fire, accepted her second cup of tea with a small, appreciative nod. "Such a delicate blend," she murmured, her pale blue eyes scanning the room as she sipped. "Is that orange blossom I detect?" "You've a remarkable palate, Miss Marple," said Lydia Dillingford with a nervous smile. She sat slightly forward on the settee, her hand hovering near the tea cakes as though unsure whether politeness or hunger should take precedence. "Miss Topham recommended it. Said it was calming for unsettled nerves." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly, a useful quality in a tea, especially these days, perhaps. Across the room, Colonel Arthur Halberd gave a brusque grunt and shifted his considerable weight in the armchair that seemed barely up to the task of containing him. "Unsettled nerves? No doubt about it. There's something in the air. Lately, a village as sleepy as Chipping Dunbridge doesn't stay this quiet without something brewing underneath." Mrs. Edith Payne, a tall and angular woman with a distinctly foreign scarf wrapped around her neck, gave a faint shiver. "That's a rather ominous thing to say, Colonel." "I don't mean ghosts and goblins, if that's what you're implying," Halberd replied. "But stillness, real stillness, never lasts in villages like ours. People aren't made for it. They get twitchy. They start making trouble. Or vanishing altogether," came a soft voice from near the window. Janet Roper, a young woman in her early 20s with cropped auburn hair and a studious expression, turned her gaze from the fading garden view. "Like Mr. Fillimore." Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "Mr. Fillimore?" "The solicitor," Lydia said with a quick glance at her husband. "Douglas Fillimore. You may not have met him. He moved into Greystone's cottage a little over 2 months ago. Quite reserved. Didn't mix," Halberd added gruffly, "which is suspicious in itself." "Oh, Arthur," Edith said disapprovingly. "Not everyone who avoids parish picnics is a criminal." Miss Marple quietly placed her cup down. "And he has disappeared?" "6 days now," said Janet. "Went out one morning, said hello to the butcher's boy, and that was the last anyone saw of him. No note, no luggage sent for. He even left his dog behind." "His dog?" Miss Marple repeated, brows lifting. "A rather serious oversight, wouldn't you say?" "Old spaniel," Halberd muttered. The constable found him whining by the garden gate 2 nights in a row. That's what raised the alarm. "It was the smell that truly did it," Edith said, her voice quieter now. "The postman noticed it by the 3rd day. Something burning. Police came round and broke in. Lump stew. Burnt to a crisp." Miss Marple's fingers laced together on her lap, the thin gold band of her watch catching the firelight. "That suggests he didn't intend to be gone long." "Was anything taken?" Lydia looked uneasy. "A suitcase, yes. but not his wallet or keys or coat, and his spectacles were still on the writing desk. Which means he didn't get far, Halberd said, and if he did, well, someone helped him. Janet hesitated. They said the police found 3 teacups on the parlor table, one with lipstick, bright red. That sparked a silence. In the room subtle but complete. Even the fire seemed to hesitate. Miss Marple tilted her head. 3 teacups. But only one showing evidence of use? No, Edith corrected. 2 had been used. One with lipstick, one without. The 3rd cup was clean. Bone china, very fine. Quite out of place, I thought, for a bachelor. Odd, Miss Marple murmured. One might almost think he was expecting a guest who never arrived. Or perhaps one who did unexpectedly. The fire flared, sending a sudden burst of sparks up the flue. Halberd leaned forward, voice low. I'll tell you what I think he met someone that night. A woman, one of those types with painted lips and fancy shoes. She came, had her tea, smiled nicely. And then she did him in. Arthur, Lydia gasped. Really? It's no less plausible than the alternative, Halberd said. Man doesn't just walk off without his wallet, dog, or spectacles? Miss Marple's voice was soft, thoughtful. But the 3rd, teacup, that's the curious part. A clean cup set out, but untouched. People rarely prepare exactly 3 cups of tea unless they are expecting 3 guests. Or if the 3rd person declines to drink. One must wonder, was it deliberate hospitality or an illusion? The conversation was interrupted by a sudden, urgent knock at the door. Not a gentle tap, but a firm, insistent rapping that startled. The room into silence. Lydia stood first, her face paling. At this hour? I'll go, said the vicar, rising with the quiet authority of a man who has comforted many at odd hours. They all waited in the drawing-room, the fire crackling. Now, with a strange, unsteady rhythm. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her hands loosely folded, eyes half closed but fully alert. Moments later, footsteps returned. Behind the vicar stood a young constable, cheeks red from the wind, hat in hand, eyes uncertain. Sorry to disturb your gathering, Reverend, but I was told Miss Marple might be here. I am, she said simply, rising without haste. Has something happened? The constable looked momentarily surprised at the frail woman before him, then quickly regained composure. Yes, miss. I've been sent from Miltonbury Station. They've made a discovery this afternoon in the woods near Greystone's cottage. The room seemed to contract, the fire no longer warm but watchful. We believe it's Mr. Phillimore, the constable continued. The body's in poor condition, but the clothing and personal effects match. We'll know for certain after. Post-mortem, but it's what was found beside him, miss. Yes? Miss Marple asked, her tone calm. The constable shifted his weight. A tray, with a teapot and 3 teacups. Just like the ones on his parlor table. Missa. Marple said nothing at first. She merely turned slowly and reached for her shawl. The room was utterly still. Well, she said at last, her voice as soft as snowfall, I suppose we'd better begin, then. By the following morning, news of the body in the woods had traveled through Chipping Dunbridge like spilled ink on blotting paper, fast, inevitable, and absorbed with relish. In the butcher's queue, in the aisles of Parsons and Trent's grocers, even between hymn verses at morning prayers, the villagers were whispering the same sentence with varying degrees of certainty. They've found him. And he was murdered. Of course, the police had not used that word, not officially. Inspector Craddock from Miltonbury had been deliberately vague during his early statement to the vicar and the constable. The condition of the body was concerning, the circumstances curious. But in a village where old sins tended to ferment rather than fade, few believed in natural causes when a man vanished and was later found beneath a hedge with a cracked teapot by his side. Miss Marple, however, did not speak of murder. Not yet. She sat that morning in the conservatory of the Dillingfords' vicarage, her knitting idle on her lap, a half-drunk cup of cool tea forgotten on the small table beside her. The roses outside were beginning to lose their summer color, their petals curled like parchment. Somewhere down the lane, The faint sound of a spade clinking against earth echoed a gravedigger, perhaps though for whom remained uncertain. Lydia Dillingford flitted in with unnecessary briskness, a half-trimmed sprig of yew still clutched in one hand. "I simply cannot abide how quickly it spread," she said, flustered. "Mrs. Boltham told me in the baker's that she heard it from the milkman's sister, who overheard Dr. Beckett discussing the condition of the body." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Oh, and what did Dr. Beckett say?" Lydia flushed. That it had been there for days, decomposing, and that his head was, well, twisted in a most unnatural way. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, as though she were being told the price of strawberries. "I believe people always expect. The worst, particularly when they haven't been invited to discover it for themselves." "It's gruesome, that's what it is," Lydia said. "And what frightens me is that no one seems to know who could have done it. Douglas Phillimore barely knew a soul here, he kept to himself. Never even attended the harvest supper." "No one keeps entirely to themselves in a village," Miss Marple said softly. "They may try, but people are like threads. Sooner or later they get pulled into the fabric." The vicar entered at that moment, looking tired and older than usual. "Craddock was here an hour ago," he said grimly, sinking into an armchair. "He wanted to speak with everyone who last saw Phillimore, if anyone even knows when that was." "Did they confirm the identity?" Lydia asked. "Yes," he said. His solicitor's card was in his coat pocket, along with a few letters, one addressed to a lady named Clarissa. Handwriting rather elegant, unfamiliar though. The address had been torn off. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Clarissa. A romantic name, suggests emotion and perhaps discretion. The vicar sighed. "I don't like it, Jane. It's left the whole village jumpy." He wasn't wrong. By midday, the general atmosphere had shifted. Children were called indoors. Sooner, curtains were drawn a little earlier. Dogs were kept on tighter leads, and even the old men who occupied the benches near the green seemed less inclined to speculate loudly about football and more inclined to eye every passerby with suspicion. At the Rusty Plough, the only inn. Chipping Dunbridge, gossip buzzed like flies in a pantry. Mrs. Tilling, the landlady, stood polishing pint glasses while customers nursed their drinks in low voices. "I'll tell you what I heard," muttered Mr. Hargreaves, the village's self-appointed historian and one-time postmaster. He wasn't a solicitor at all, not a real one, anyhow. He didn't even register with the London bar. Some say he was hiding from something or someone. "Rot," grunted Mr. Medway, who drove the coal lorry. "He was just quiet. One of those modern types. Came down from London to get away from noise, probably. He had money, though," said Mrs. Tilling, lowering her voice. "Paid for the cottage in cash, I heard. No mortgage. Who does that unless they've something to hide?" They all turned as the door creaked open. Janet Roper stepped in, her cheeks flushed, the wind tugging her scarf loose. She looked as though she hadn't slept. "I heard the woman with the red lipstick was seen leaving the post office last Tuesday," she said, lowering her voice as she joined them. Tall, dark hair, coat with a fur collar. Matched the description someone gave of a woman who called at Greystones the week Phillimore. Vanished. "Who gave the description?" Medway asked. Janet shrugged. "No one's saying. But word is the inspector's looking for her now. Some think she came from London. Some say she never left." Mrs. Tilling raised an eyebrow. "Well, if she's still here, she's being very clever about hiding." Not far from the inn, Miss Marple walked slowly along the gravel path that led past Greystone's cottage. It had been cordoned off, of course yellow tape, a padlock on the gate, a police notice posted on the door, but something about it made her pause. The garden was neglected, though not wild. Someone had cared for it once, at least minimally. A rosebush had bloomed twice over, out of season. Her gaze moved to the small bench near the hedge. Damp from recent rain, it bore a faint impression recent. As though someone had sat there quite recently, watching. 3 teacups, she murmured aloud. 2 used, 1 clean. Why would one offer tea and not expect all to drink? She turned as the constable from the night before approached. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said politely. You're not supposed to be here, technically. Forgive me, she said sweetly. I find that walking sharpens the memory. And I was trying to remember something I once heard about a man who vanished quite like this many years ago. But in that case it was the lack of tea that gave it away. The constable looked confused. Miss Marple merely smiled and moved on. By evening, the village was positively humming with theories. Theories that involved jealousy, blackmail, mistaken identity, and one particularly enthusiastic suggestion of international espionage. But amidst all of it, Miss Marple sat again in the vicarage drawing room, her needles finally in motion, her expression serene. Only the tiniest furrow between her brows betrayed her deeper thoughts. She'd seen something not much, but just enough to trouble her. The lipstick, the third teacup, the letter addressed to Clarissa, and now a bench near a hedge with a recent impression. It wasn't proof, but it was the beginning of something. And as Miss Marple well knew, in the quiet corners of English villages, beginnings were never to be underestimated. The morning after the discovery of Douglas Phillimore's body dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed undecided to rain or simply sulk. A thick mist clung to the hedgerows, turning the lanes of Chipping Dunbridge into narrow corridors of damp silence. Inside the village post office, part sorting station, part general store, and full-time information exchange inspector, Craddock stood tapping his pencil on the counter as Mrs. Gilly Brown rummaged behind it for the register of outbound parcels. "Most people post their letters at the pillar box," she muttered, lifting a leather-bound ledger. "But Mr. Phillimore, yes, he always brought his directly here. Very precise about it, too. Used to ask me for fresh blotting paper. Most particular. Did he ever send packages?" Craddock asked, his tone polite but clipped. "Twice," Mrs. Brown said, flipping pages. "Once to an address in London, Bloomsbury, I think. The other to Yorkshire. Plain brown parcel, tied with string, rather old-fashioned. Like something from a storybook? Any names?" She squinted. "The one to London was to a Miss C. Hargreaves. That was about 5 weeks ago. The Yorkshire one I'll have to look up. But I do recall he paid cash, never wanted receipts." Craddock nodded, scribbling quickly. "And did he ever receive packages?" "Oh, yes," she said. "But not often. Just the one, actually. From France, I believe. Arrived in August. Box of writing paper, monogrammed. I remember it because he was quite irritated, said the paper was the wrong shade of ivory. Took it straight back to his cottage. Monogrammed?" Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Yes. DP and gold leaf. Lovely quality. Not the sort you find at our stationers." Craddock made a note. Behind him, Miss Marple stood pretending to examine a row of biscuit tins, her hat tipped ever so slightly forward. She made no sound, but her ears were open, and her fingers, resting on her handbag, drummed once imperceptibly. As the inspector thanked Mrs. Brown and exited into the mist, Miss Marple moved to the counter. "Morning, Gilly dear," she said with gentle cheer. "Do you still stock that lemon barley water Raymond likes?" Mrs. Brown brightened. "Just got a crate in yesterday, Miss Marple. Shall I set one aside?" "If you would be so kind, and I couldn't help overhearing." "A Miss C. Hargreaves, did you say? Such an uncommon name." Mrs. Brown pursed her lips. "Yes, though if you ask me, Miss C. could be short for Clarissa, couldn't it?" "It could indeed," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "Names are such revealing things. People rarely name their daughters Clarissa unless they've certain romantic aspirations." Mrs. Brown chuckled, flattered by the attention. "Quite right." Miss Marple left shortly after with her package and an armful of vague thoughts. She took the long way back to the vicarage, passing Greystone's cottage again. A police car stood in the driveway, and a young man in plain clothes was photographing the front steps. She lingered by the gate, pretending to admire the drooping hydrangeas. She thought again of the 3 teacups. 2 used, 1 untouched. And the red lipstick. She remembered it clearly how Janet had described it, bright red, not a timid color, no, it suggested someone bold, possibly theatrical, possibly accustomed to being watched. Inside Greystone's, Inspector Craddock stood in what passed for the parlor. It was a tidy room, functional but not cold. No excess of decoration, but a few curious choices: a Persian rug faded with time, a well-worn chess set with the knights out of place, and a small watercolor painting of a woman in profile, face turned away, but hair pinned with something. Jewel-toned, he turned to Sergeant Wickham. "Still nothing definitive on the visitor?" "No one's come forward," Wickham replied. "We canvassed the neighbors again. Mrs. Beckwith said she saw a tall woman in a dark coat leaving Greystones. The weak Phillimore vanished, but it was dusk. Said her walk was confident, whatever that means. Clothing, black coat, fur collar, heels, couldn't see the face." Craddock looked at the chessboard again. He picked up a knight and turned it absently in his fingers. "We're not looking for a simple criminal here, Wickham. Whoever this woman was, she knew Phillimore well enough to be invited for tea. Or confident enough to serve herself? She left her mark behind. Lipstick, Craddock said, very deliberate. You don't sip from a cup like that by accident. It's a statement. She wanted someone to know she'd been there. In another part of the village, Miss Marple visited Dr. Beckett under the pretense of returning a borrowed gardening book. The doctor, a mild-mannered widower with far more plants in his sitting room than patients in his waiting room, welcomed her with a smile. "Miss Marple, you do know I have no intention of ever asking for that book back. Your tulips put mine to shame." She laughed lightly, but her eyes were watchful. "Oh, but I always return what I borrow. It's a matter of principle. And while I'm here, I thought I might ask you something that's been puzzling me." "By all means. You treated Mr. Phillimore, didn't you?" The doctor blinked, once, just after he arrived. He had a mild case of bronchitis, quite self-sufficient, really. Didn't like interference. "Did he ever speak of anyone any?" "Visitors, family?" "No," Dr. Beckett said slowly. "In fact, I got the impression he rather resented company. He wasn't unpleasant, but he had the manner of a man who'd been disappointed by someone, or perhaps betrayed." "Betrayal can leave a long shadow," Miss Marple murmured. "Even in a small cottage in a peaceful village." She left. Soon after, but her mind was far from at rest. She walked a slow circle around the green, watching as children played hopscotch. As the postman made his rounds, as Lydia Dillingford spoke in hushed tones with the baker's wife near the church gate. The village was a clock, ticking rhythmically, reliably, except now one cog was out of sync. It wasn't the death alone that unsettled Miss Marple. Death, she knew, came often and sometimes with scandal. No, it was the symmetry of it all. The teacups, the letter, the tray by the body, too balanced, as though someone had staged it, not in haste but in ritual. That evening, as the vicar lit the fire, Miss Marple sat quietly watching the flames dance behind the iron grate. "I believe," she said finally, "that Mr. Phillimore was afraid, not of being found, but of being forgotten. He set the table for three because he expected, perhaps needed more than one truth to meet him." The vicar turned. "Jane, you don't believe this was random, do you?" "No," she said softly, still watching the fire. "Nor do I believe it was recent." She picked up her knitting again. "You see, John, some deaths happen long before a body is found. It's just that nobody realizes it until someone knocks over a teacup." By Thursday, the village had assigned the crime to no fewer than 4 suspects, 5 if one counted Mrs. Fosdyke's gardener, who happened to have shifty eyes and once spelled pheasant incorrectly in the vegetable. Competition entry forms. But while tongues wagged, Inspector Craddock focused on people who had actually interacted with the victim, and a few had begun to emerge. The first was Thomas Little, a tradesman who had done minor repair work at Greystones Cottage the week before Mr. Phillimore's disappearance. The second was Vera Lawton, a woman from Miltonbury who had been seen visiting Phillimore twice, both times at dusk. And the third was Miss Janet Roper, the young niece of Dr. Beckett, an unexpected addition to the suspect list, though not to Miss Marple. "She always seemed a bit too eager to volunteer information," Miss Marple remarked to the vicar as they walked the short path from the church to the post office. "Not that I doubt her sincerity, but sincerity is not the same as truth." John, I learned that watching girl guides deny responsibility for stolen ginger biscuits. Craddock's interviews had begun in earnest that day, conducted at the reading room annex of the town hall, where the scent of mildew was as thick as the dust on the windowsills. Little arrived first in his paint-flecked overalls, removing his cap with an awkward sort of respect. "I only fixed the guttering," he said, looking at the floor. "Didn't even go inside." "But you did go inside," Craddock corrected, referring to a witness statement from Mrs. Anstruther, the next-door neighbor, who had noted seeing Little carry a toolbox through the front door. Little squirmed. "Only just inside, sir." Into the hallway, like Mr. Phillimore was nervous about me tracking dirt on his carpets. Bit fussy. What sort of fussy? Well, he didn't like noise, or questions, you know the sort. Paid exact money, too, no more, no less. Didn't offer tea or anything. Just stood there, watching. Craddock tapped his pencil. "And did you see or hear anyone else while you were working?" Little hesitated. He was talking on the telephone once. Quiet voice, I couldn't make out much, just something about Tuesday being too soon. And then he saw me listening and shut the door. Miss Marple, who was not officially present, was nearby helping Lydia Dillinford catalog books for the Harvest Festival jumble. She noted the tradesman's hesitation and the way he clenched his cap in both hands as he left. After Little, Vera Lawton appeared dramatic in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. She wore a long green scarf and gloves too elegant for practical use. Miss Marple watched from the far end of the annex as Vera crossed her legs precisely and lit a cigarette, with fingers that didn't quite tremble. "Yes, I knew Douglas," Vera said, exhaling smoke like a stage actress finishing an act. "We were acquaintances, shall we say. He did some private legal work for me when I separated from my husband. Very discreet." "You visited him?" "Twice," Craddock said. "Why?" "The first was to drop off some papers," she replied. "The second was personal. I thought we might talk over tea. It rained that day. I remember because I borrowed an umbrella, a ghastly tartan thing. Never returned it. I suppose I should feel guilty now." "Did he mention any other visitors?" "No." She paused, then smiled faintly. "He wasn't the type to gossip." "Did you notice anything unusual? Was he agitated?" "Agitated?" Her laugh was thin. "No, Inspector. Douglas was the sort of man who carried all his storms inside. I don't believe anyone really knew what he was thinking." Miss Marple watched Vera closely. She sensed tiny cracks in the woman's confidence, an over-rehearsed air, a polished grief that didn't quite fit, and the scarf. Green silk, floral print, but fastened with a pin shaped like a thistle. Not an accessory easily overlooked. Not unless one wanted it remembered. Later that afternoon, Janet Roper arrived for her interview. To his credit, Craddock treated her with the same formal tone as he had the others, though her youth and local ties lent her an air of misplaced trustworthiness. "I didn't know Mr. Phillimore well," she said. "I only saw him in the village twice. Once at the grocer's and once on the footpath by the stream." We nodded, that was all. "But you mentioned the red lipstick," Craddock said. "How did you know about that?" Janet hesitated. "I overheard it. Someone mentioned it in the pub, and I just repeated it." "Who mentioned it?" "I can't remember." "It might have been Mr. Medway." Craddock's pencil paused. "Mr. Medway denies saying anything of the sort." Janet flushed. "Then I suppose I must have misremembered." Miss Marple, seated nearby under the pretense of mending a torn hymn book, watched the girl's hands. They were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Not the manner of someone indifferent. Not guilt necessarily, but fear. And fear, Miss Marple knew, had a habit of whispering when it ought to be silent. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the village settled into uneasy twilight, Miss Marple gathered her thoughts beside the fire once more. The vicar and Lydia were finishing supper in the next room, their clinking cutlery providing a steady, domestic rhythm. "I find it interesting," she said aloud, though no one was there to hear her, "that all three of them were connected to Phillimore only recently. A tradesman, a woman in legal distress, and a girl barely old enough to vote. None of them true friends." but all adjacent to his life, close enough to be drawn in. Not close enough to know him well. She folded her hands in her lap. But someone did know him well. Knew his habits, his teacups, his tendency to make lamb stew. Someone who knew he wouldn't go far without his spectacles or his dog. She sat quietly for some time until Lydia came in with the tea tray. "I heard Craddock may be questioning people from outside the village next," Lydia said. "There's talk of a woman in Tunbridge Wells who once worked with Phillimore in London." "Is there indeed?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "How very thorough." But her eyes betrayed a sharper edge. There were too many shadows cast around the victim, and none seemed to fall quite naturally. Every suspect so far had a faint smell of performance either too distant or too rehearsed. And Miss Marple, more than anyone, knew that real guilt rarely came in such polished packages. The days that followed the discovery of Douglas Phillimore's body settled into a steady rhythm of questions, examinations, and whispered conjectures. Inspector Craddock and his team worked diligently, collecting testimonies, scouring the village, and painstakingly piecing together the fragments of the man's final days. Yet to many, the mystery deepened rather than unraveled. Miss Marple, for her part, moved with the quiet certainty of a seasoned observer, weaving gently through the village's fabric, her eyes attuned to the smallest details others overlooked. It was in the little things, a pause in conversation, a hesitation before a denial, a cup of tea left untouched, that she found the threads which might ultimately bind the truth. That morning, Miss Marple found herself invited to the Miltonbury police station. The inspector wished to speak with her not as a suspect, of course, but as someone with a keen understanding of human nature and the peculiar rhythms of village life. She arrived with her usual calm, her gray hair tucked beneath a neat hat, and her hands folded delicately in front of her. The station was a modest building, with peeling paint on the windowsills and a faint smell of boiled cabbage in the air. Inside, Inspector Craddock greeted her with a nod, motioning toward a worn wooden chair beside his desk. "Miss Marple," he began, "you have a reputation for seeing what others miss. I wonder if you might help me with something. We've been through the cottage, the body, the possessions. And yet there's one detail that troubles me." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I'm listening." Craddock tapped a file on his desk. "This photograph was taken at the scene. You'll notice the tray with the teapot and the 3 cups. The cups are standard bone china, ordinary, if a little fine. But look closely at the saucers." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. The photo was grainy, but the saucers were visible, arranged in a neat triangle. One bore a faint but unmistakable smudge, a pale streak, almost translucent. "A fingerprint," she murmured. "Yes," Craddock said. "A partial print. Smudged enough to be difficult to identify, but certainly there. It was on the saucer with no lipstick, the 3rd teacup." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Curious? The cup that was not used bears the mark of a finger. Who would hold a cup without drinking from it?" "That's what puzzles us," the inspector said. "Why prepare 3 cups and not use one? And why leave a fingerprint on the unused saucer? We've tried to match it with all known prints, but no match so far." Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly on her lap. "Sometimes the most significant clues are those intended to be overlooked." Craddock leaned back. "Exactly. The body was found near the cottage, clutching that very tray. The cups intact, the teapot cold. Whoever killed Phillimore seemed to want to stage the scene, make a statement. But a statement to whom?" Miss Marple asked softly. "And what message?" Craddock shrugged. "That's what we're trying to figure out." Miss Marple stood and adjusted her shawl. "May I see the teacups themselves?" Craddock nodded, leading her to a small evidence room where the tray and its contents rested under glass. She studied the cups carefully. The one with lipstick showed neat, deliberate marks around the rim. The other used cup was plain, without marks. The 3rd was clean except for that faint fingerprint. "What of the contents?" she asked. "We tested the teapot," Craddock answered. "The last brew was a strong black tea, likely served late the previous evening. No poison or contaminants found." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "Then the poison, if there was one, was administered by other means." Or perhaps the murder wasn't planned for that evening at all. She turned to Craddock. "May I ask, have you investigated the letter addressed to Clarissa? The one found in Mr. Phillimore's coat?" Craddock nodded. "Yes. No such person in Chipping Dunbridge, and no one with that name has come forward. Could it be a pseudonym?" Miss Marple asked thoughtfully. "Possibly," the inspector agreed. "Or someone who wanted to remain hidden." Miss Marple considered this. "In my experience, a name like Clarissa Elegant and somewhat romantic suggests a woman who values privacy. Or perhaps secrecy." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Sergeant Wickham entered with a small envelope. "Inspector, a message just came for you. From Miltonberry, it's regarding the prints." Craddock opened the envelope and scanned the contents quickly. "We've got a partial match," he said grimly. "A woman's print. From a Miss Vera Lawton." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "The lady who visited Mr. Phillimore. Precisely." The inspector sighed. "She's come under suspicion now." Miss Marple smiled faintly, a gesture that held both amusement and caution. "You see, John, this is where the human puzzle grows most tangled. A fingerprint on an unused cup, a mysterious woman with a penchant for secrecy, and a man who seemed burdened by shadows we have yet to uncover." The inspector rubbed his forehead. "I don't know how we'll untangle it all, but your insight is invaluable." After leaving the station, Miss Marple took a detour to the village library, where she often found solace among dusty shelves and forgotten volumes. She pulled a book from the shelf, an old collection of letters and diaries from local families, and began to leaf through the brittle pages. Her thoughts returned to the bench near the hedge at Greystone's cottage, the one that bore the recent impression. Someone had sat there, waiting, watching, and perhaps sipping tea. That night in the vicarage drawing-room, the firelight flickering, Miss Marple sat with her knitting once more. Her mind was busy with fragments of the past days, the tradesman's half-heard phone call, the lady with the green scarf, the young woman's nervousness, the letter to Clarissa, the fingerprint. She reflected on how each piece might fit, not in isolation, but as part of a greater whole. "Sometimes," she mused quietly to herself, "the greatest clues are hidden in what we do not see. A teacup not touched, a name not spoken aloud, a moment stolen beneath the watching stars." With a steady hand she reached for her teacup, and lifted it gently, examining the rim as if expecting to find the answer etched there. But mysteries, she knew well, were rarely so obliging. The afternoon sun, waning toward evening, cast long shadows over Chipping Dunbridge, lending a somber glow to the village lanes and shuttered windows. News traveled too fast. Thought, and as the day wore on, tensions began to rise like the swelling tide. Beneath the polite veneer of village life, secrets stirred and quiet confrontations erupted in unexpected corners. Miss Marple had learned early in life that such moments were the hidden marrow of any mystery. It was when people felt fear, guilt, or desperation that their true selves slipped through the cracks. That afternoon she visited the village hall, where a gathering was convened to address concerns over the murder and to assist the police. The room buzzed with nervous energy as villagers exchanged cautious glances, whispered accusations, and reluctant confessions. At the heart of the crowd stood Thomas Little, the tradesman, who seemed increasingly ill at ease. Beside him, Vera Lawton was impeccably poised, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of something sharper impatience or defiance. Across the room, Janet Roper sat quietly on a bench, her fingers twisting a handkerchief as she avoided most eye contact. The vicar, John Dillingford, took the podium to call the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming," he began, voice steady but solemn. "We are gathered not only to support each other in these troubling times, but to cooperate fully with Inspector Craddock's investigation. It is imperative we remember the values of our community: honesty, kindness, and above all, respect." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. Miss Marple observed the room carefully. A man near the back, Mr. Medway the coal driver, whispered loudly to his neighbor, "You mark my words, it's one of them. City folk, no place in a village like this." Vera's eyes flicked toward him, narrowing before she turned away sharply. After the vicar's brief speech, Inspector Craddock stepped forward. His tone was formal but held a trace of weariness. "We have interviewed several people connected to Mr. Phillimore," he said. "Several matters require clarification, and some new information has come to light. I ask anyone who has knowledge, no matter how small, to come forward." The room fell into a heavy silence. It was broken abruptly by a voice from the side. "I have something to say," said Janet Roper, standing unsteadily. I didn't tell you everything before." All eyes turned toward her. She swallowed nervously and continued. "On the evening Mr. Phillimore disappeared, I saw someone near Greystone's cottage. A woman. She wasn't wearing the coat described, but she had red hair, very bright. She was arguing with a man I couldn't see clearly. I didn't want to get involved before, but now it feels wrong to keep it secret." Vera's face flushed, and she stepped forward swiftly. "That's not true," she exclaimed. "Janet, you must be mistaken. I wasn't near Greystone's that evening." Janet looked down, voice shaking. "I'm certain of what I saw." The vicar raised a hand. "Please, let's keep calm." Thomas Little cleared his throat. "I was near Greystone's, too. Fixed a broken latch on the gate that same evening, heard raised voices, but I didn't see who they were." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Did you hear what was said?" "No, just the tone, angry." The mention of raised voices sent a ripple through the crowd. Whispers multiplied. Miss Marple noticed how Vera's fingers clenched tightly around the edge of her jacket. The woman was visibly rattled. After the meeting, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Lydia Dillingford down the village lane. "People don't like secrets, Jane," Lydia said softly. "They want everything clear and simple. But it's never that way." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Secrets are the soil from which suspicion grows." They passed the bakery, where Mrs. Boltham was locking up, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of a wary glance exchanged between her and a man who had lingered too long nearby. Later that evening, Miss Marple was invited to Vera Lawton's lodgings by a neighbor, Mrs. Carroway, a woman known for her charitable nature but also for having an ear everywhere. The visit was ostensibly to fetch a book Vera had left behind, but the conversation quickly turned to the matter of the murder. Vera's drawing room was tastefully furnished, with heavy curtains drawn and a faint scent of jasmine in the air. Vera herself appeared more composed than during the meeting, but still bore the tension of a coiled spring. "Miss Marple," Vera began, "I understand the suspicions, but you must believe me, I had nothing to do with Douglas Phillimore's death." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I do not suspect you, Vera, but I do suspect that you carry burdens. Would you care to share any?" Vera hesitated, then nodded. Douglas was more complicated than anyone realized. He had secrets, dark ones. I only wished to help him, but in the end, I think he was running from more than just the past. "Do you know what he was running from?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "A man," Vera said after a long pause. "An old business partner. They had a falling out years ago. Something about money. I don't know the details, only that it ended badly." "Did Mr. Phillimore ever say this man's name?" "No, but I heard him mention Clarissa often. Not as a woman, but as a code, I think, something to do with a lost trust." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Mrs. Carroway admitted a young woman, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. "It's Janet," she whispered. She wanted to speak with Vera. The three women exchanged glances. When Janet entered, she looked from Vera to Miss Marple, then hesitated. "I overheard something today," Janet said in a low voice. "Something about a letter. One that Douglas sent but never arrived." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "A letter?" "Yes, to someone named Clarissa." "Which Clarissa?" Vera asked. "I don't know. But the letter was important. And it was lost or stolen." Miss Marple's mind raced through the implications. The night deepened and the village's tangled web of secrets thickened. Every new confession, every reluctant admission only added layers to the mystery, but it also drew Miss Marple's attention to the subtle human nuances, the glance, the hesitation, the carefully concealed tremor of a voice. She returned home later, her thoughts a quiet whirl. In the drawing room, the fire flickered and the shadows lengthened. "People hide truths as they hide their faults," she murmured. But when fear grows loud, even silence can speak. And in that silence, Miss Marple felt the first unmistakable stirrings of the real story beneath the surface. The rain began just after dawn, a cold, persistent drizzle that wrapped itself around Chipping Dunbridge like a damp shawl. Mist hung low over the green, veiling the cottages and hedgerows in a ghostly hush. Even the birdsong seemed subdued, as though nature herself were holding her breath. Miss Marple sat by her parlor window, knitting needles clicking with rhythmic serenity. But her mind was far from tranquil. The mention of a missing letter, a name used as a code Clarissa, and the subtle shifts in behavior from people she'd known for decades all pointed to a knot of motives and secrets not yet unraveled. A sharp rap on the door interrupted her reverie. She rose, joints a touch stiff in the damp, and opened it to find Inspector Craddock standing there, hat in hand, coat beaded with rain. "May I come in, Miss Marple?" he asked. "Of course, dear boy. You look positively soaked. Sit down by the fire while I fetch some tea." As he settled into the armchair near the hearth, she disappeared into the kitchen. When she returned, a tray of hot tea and scones in hand, Craddock was staring thoughtfully at the dying embers. "I trust your visit is more than social?" Miss Marple asked gently, pouring his tea. Craddock smiled wanly. "I thought you might like to hear something before it reaches every gossiping mouth from here to Paddington." Miss Marple arched a brow. "Oh, that sounds ominous." Craddock leaned forward. "Greystone's cottage was broken into last night." "Broken into?" she echoed, startled. "Yes, window smashed at the back. Nothing of value taken as far as we can tell, no silver, no cash, no keepsakes. But the place was rummaged through. Drawers pulled out, books tossed from shelves, even the teacups in the kitchen cupboard moved around. Miss Marple's needles lay idle in her lap. "And the letter?" she asked. Craddock raised his eyebrows. "You think that's what they were after?" "I think," she replied slowly, "that it's most curious, isn't it? That a man who vanishes under peculiar circumstances, and who may have sent an important letter possibly never received, should have his home turned upside down the day after that very letter is mentioned in public." The inspector sipped his tea, nodding thoughtfully. "You're right. The question is, who knew about the letter?" "Janet Roper did, or overheard it mentioned," she said. "But that doesn't mean she was the only one who knew." "And Vera Lawton?" Craddock asked. "She may know more than she admits," Miss Marple said carefully, "but I do not think she is a thief." Craddock frowned. "She might not need to be if she's hiding something that was already hers, or trying to stop something from being found." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Would you say the intruder was familiar with the house?" "No signs of hesitation," Craddock admitted. "Whoever it was, they moved quickly, efficiently." "That," Miss Marple murmured, "suggests not desperation, but purpose." Later that morning, the village was buzzing with the news. At the grocer's, two women debated whether the same person who murdered Douglas Fillimore had now returned to cover their tracks. At the bakery, someone swore they saw a shadow moving across the field behind Greystones shortly before midnight. And in the library, Vera Lawton's name was being whispered far too often for comfort. Meanwhile, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Janet Roper. The young woman looked pale and drawn as she opened the door, as though she'd slept poorly. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, stepping back to let her in. "I hoped you'd come. It's all becoming so frightful." Miss Marple sat gently on the edge of the settee and studied her. "Janet, when you overheard Mr. Fillimore mention a letter to Clarissa, where were you?" Janet bit her lip. "At the post office. He was speaking to Miss Tunley." "I was in." "The back room, doing the ledgers?" "I think he thought no one else was there." "And he didn't say who Clarissa was?" "No," Janet said slowly, "but he said something like, 'She must never see it.' I remember that exactly." Miss Marple's brows rose. "Interesting. And what was Miss Tunley's reply?" "She didn't say much. Just that she would handle it discreetly." Miss Marple stood. "Thank you, my dear. That's very helpful." Outside, the clouds had broken slightly, and a thin shaft of sunlight touched the green. Miss Marple paused there, thinking. Miss Tunley? The ever-proper, unsmiling postmistress. Could she be the link? Not many people knew the comings and goings of villagers better than the postmistress sent what, who received which parcels, which letters were marked urgent or returned, and more importantly, who might wish to intercept a letter that should never have reached its intended destination. She made her way there next. The post office, as always, smelled faintly of ink and old paper. Miss Tunley was behind the counter, sorting a bundle of brown envelopes. "Good morning, Miss Tunley," Miss Marple said brightly. The woman gave a polite but reserved smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Wet again, I see. I'm afraid so. It's the sort of weather that invites introspection, don't you think?" Miss Tunley looked puzzled. "I suppose—" Miss Marple leaned in. "I was wondering, purely from curiosity, of course, do you remember a letter Douglas Phillimore posted shortly before his disappearance? One addressed to Clarissa?" The woman froze, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I handle many letters, Miss Marple. I couldn't possibly recall one in particular." "But if it had been withheld or intercepted?" Miss Marple asked gently. Now Miss Tunley's fingers tightened around the envelope in her hand. "I wouldn't do that," she said. "I would never tamper with the post." "No, of course not," Miss Marple said kindly. "Still, if someone had asked you to misplace a letter someone persuasive or dangerous, you might not have had a choice." Miss Tunley said nothing. Outside, Miss Marple smiled slightly. She didn't need a confession. The reaction had been enough. That evening, a second twist came to light. Thomas Little had vanished. His absence was first noted when he failed to report to a repair job in a neighboring village. His wife, anxious, reported that he had gone out early in the morning, supposedly, to check the locks at the village hall, and hadn't returned. Inspector Craddock was quick to respond. "He's not the type to run," he said grimly. "But he may have known more than he admitted," Miss Marple agreed. Another disappearance. Another silence. Another man whose quiet life perhaps wasn't so quiet after all. The circle was tightening, but not yet closed. Miss Marple was knitting again, but not with her usual contented rhythm. Her fingers moved with mechanical precision, her thoughts, turning not to pearl stitches, but to absences of people, of letters, of truth. Thomas Little's disappearance had cast a pall over the village, grimmer even than the murder of Douglas Phillimore. A murder, after all, was final. A disappearance suggested possibility of flight, of hiding, or of a second silencing. By late afternoon, the news had reached every corner of Chipping Dunbridge. Mrs. Plum at the bakery had declared it another disgrace upon the village, while Mr. Woodrow at the chemist's insisted it was a sign of deepening conspiracy. Only one person seemed unbothered, Vera Lawton. She had resumed her daily walks, her coat impeccable, her heels clicking confidently over the flagstone paths. To an outsider she might have appeared dignified. To those who knew her, there was something vaguely rehearsed about her poise now, as though she were waiting for something or someone to make a wrong move. Miss Marple observed this from her garden gate. "Miss Lawton," she called, waving lightly. Vera turned, composed as ever. "Miss Marple, what a dreary afternoon." "Indeed, but the roses needed the rain, I suppose. Would you come? And for a cup of tea?" There was a slight hesitation, no more than a blink, but Vera nodded. "Thank you, that would be lovely." Inside, Miss Marple ushered her into the sitting room. The tea was already laid, the third teacup delicate, floral, faintly cracked at the base placed in a precise position. Vera's eyes flicked too. "That's a charming piece," she remarked. "Is it new?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said gently. "It's been with me for years. Always my third place setting, you know. I so rarely have 3 guests at once, but when I do, that cup always finds its way to the table." Vera smiled, but Miss Marple caught the flash of something behind her eyes, discomfort, perhaps, or recognition. They drank in silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple, quite casually, said, "Poor Mr. Little, I do hope he turns up soon. I find disappearances even more distressing than deaths. They leave too much room for the imagination, don't they?" Vera's teaspoon clinked against the saucer. "He's probably gone off in a panic. Guilt makes people do foolish things. You think he was guilty of something?" Vera didn't answer at first. Then she said, he always struck me as someone easily manipulated. Perhaps he got involved in something he couldn't handle. Like what? Oh, I don't know, Vera replied, waving a hand dismissively. Business matters, or private ones. He did have a temper, you know. Miss Marple studied her, nodding slowly. And you, my dear, how are you bearing up? Vera gave a brittle laugh. It's exhausting being suspected of something you didn't do. Quite, especially when one's past is dragged up and examined in the worst light. Vera stiffened slightly. I've nothing to hide, Miss Marple. No, the older woman said, but perhaps others think you do. There was silence again. The fire crackled, and the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece filled the space between them. Miss Marple reached for the teapot and offered another pour. Vera nodded. As Miss Marple filled her cup, she said lightly, I've always found that the most revealing things are the small ones, like how someone reacts when they see a particular object, something familiar or a thought lost, or how they respond to the mention of a name that hasn't been spoken in years. Vera sipped her tea. Is that what you're doing, Miss Marple? Watching my reactions? Oh, not at all, Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. I'm far too old to play games. I merely observe, as one does with flowers or birds. People follow patterns, my dear. And occasionally one spots an oddity, a robin behaving like a jay, so to speak. Vera stood abruptly. I should go. Thank you for the tea. Miss Marple didn't stop her. As the door closed, she allowed herself a moment of silence. Then she stood, walked to her writing desk, and retrieved a folded note from inside a book of household accounts. The note had been slipped under her door that morning. It was unsigned. He never sent the letter, but he made a copy. I know where it is. She had an idea who had written it, tentative, scared. Likely someone who had been silent too long. She pocketed the note and fetched her coat. The old vestry behind St. Andrew's Church had long been used for storage boxes of hymnals, crumbling, candlesticks, and the occasional broken pew. But Miss Marple knew it was also a place where certain people met in secrecy, teenagers for one. And more recently, by all appearances, someone searching for something hidden. Inside it was dim and smelled of dust and wax. Miss Marple moved slowly, lifting a cloth from a pile of books. Glancing behind shelves, nothing. Then she saw it wedged between two hymnals, behind a warped panel in the wall. A small leather-bound address book. She opened it. Inside, pressed, between pages, was a folded sheet of paper typed, crisped, despite its age. Dearest Clarissa, if you are reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. I entrusted the original to someone I thought reliable, but I must preserve the truth, Miss Marple read quickly, her expression tightening. It wasn't just a love letter. It was a confession. Douglas Phillimore had discovered something, a crime. Not of blood, but of deceit. A financial swindle committed years ago, hidden beneath layers of trust and village civility. And the person he'd trusted to help deliver this warning had betrayed him. She folded the paper again and replaced it carefully. As she emerged into the pale dusk light, she found herself face to face with Janet Roper. The girl looked terrified. Her hands trembled. I saw you come in, Janet whispered. I couldn't say in the letter. I didn't know who to trust. You did the right thing, Miss Marple said gently. It was you who found the copy, wasn't it? Janet nodded. Behind the panel. He must have hidden it just before it happened. Have you told anyone else? No, but I think someone followed me yesterday. I thought it was Mr. Little, but now, her voice broke. I'm not sure. Miss Marple placed a hand on her arm. Don't be frightened, my dear, but from now on, don't go anywhere alone. Do you think Mr. Little is dead? Miss Marple hesitated. I think, she said softly, that someone is very determined to make sure this truth stays hidden. But lies, like weeds, have a way of pushing through. She looked out across the graveyard, the village rooftops beyond silvered by the fading light. The time for a quiet observation was nearing its end. The following morning dawned gray and close, with heavy clouds pressing low over the chimneys of Chipping Dunbridge. The air was thick with unshed rain, and the village held its collective breath. Inside the vicarage, Reverend Pembroke was at his desk, shuffling through correspondence with a distracted air. His wife, Margaret, bustled in carrying a silver tray, bearing tea and buttered scones. "You haven't touched your breakfast," she said, her voice edged with worry. "Not hungry," Pembroke murmured. "I've been thinking about Thomas Little." "As everyone has," Margaret said gently. "It's unsettling, all this. So many shadows over our village." The vicar looked up. "What do you make of Miss Marple in all this?" Margaret paused. "She's unusually quiet, which means she's unusually active." Pembroke gave a short laugh. "Yes, she reminds me of a swan so graceful above the water, but paddling furiously underneath." Margaret poured the tea. "Do you think she knows something?" "I think," said the vicar, "that she always knows more than she says." Miss Marple, meanwhile, was not in her usual chair by the hearth. She had taken a walk down to the bridge by the old mill pond, where the reeds swayed in the wind and the air smelled of moss and still water. She carried a satchel over her arm, and a small notepad tucked neatly beside her gloves. Janet Roper had kept her word. She had told no one about the letter. But Miss Marple knew the time for secrecy was drawing to a close. Pieces were aligning, but not all had fallen into place. And there was still the matter of the third teacup. She thought again of Vera Lawton's reaction, so carefully masked, and of the note that had warned of a copy. Someone had known about Douglas Phillimore's intention to write the letter, and that same someone had ensured the original never reached Clarissa. Why? Because the truth inside it threatened something or someone? She turned and began walking toward High Gables. The Lawton house stood aloof on a rise above the village, half concealed behind yew hedges and ivy-covered walls. Its age gave it character, but also a sense of secrets buried deep in its foundations. Miss Marple had visited once before, years ago, when Vera's father was still alive. She rang the bell. After a pause, the housekeeper, Mrs. Edkins, opened the door. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it? Miss Lawton's not at home." "No matter," Miss Marple replied cheerfully. "I was merely taking a walk. Might I speak to you instead, Mrs. Edkins? A quick word about the Firelight gathering, if I may." The housekeeper looked uncertain but nodded. "Come through to the kitchen. I was just steeping the tea." Inside, the kitchen smelled of lemons and polish. Miss Marple sat near the window, her expression amiable but her thoughts sharp. "Mrs. Edkins, I wonder, the evening of the gathering, did Miss Lawton prepare the tea herself?" "No," the woman said. "I did it, as usual. She arranged the seating, but I brought the tray and the cups." "And how many cups did you bring?" "3, always 3, when it's just a few of them." "They were expecting Miss Phillimore, of course." "That was before everything happened." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did you notice anything odd after Miss Phillimore failed to arrive?" The woman frowned. Miss Lawton was flustered. Certainly seemed nervous. But then again, she always got that way around Douglas. "They never got on." "No," Miss Marple murmured. "They didn't." Mrs. Edkins poured her a cup of tea. Miss Marple took a sip, then said mildly, "Was the third cup cleared away later?" "Oh, I did it, but it hadn't been touched." "No lipstick? No trace of use at all?" "No, it was clean," Miss Lawton said, to put it straight back on the shelf. A pause. Miss Marple glanced down at her gloves, smoothing a crease with delicate fingers. "Thank you, Mrs. Edkins. You've been very helpful." That afternoon, Miss Marple made one more call, this time to Inspector Cray. He received her in his office. Looking overworked and disheveled, his waistcoat unbuttoned and hair slightly mussed. "I can't say I've made much progress, Miss Marple," he confessed. No sign of Little. No leads from the surrounding villages. And the forensic report on Phillimore's teacup yielded nothing. Clean as a whistle. Miss Marple sat primly, hands folded. "Inspector," she said, "I wonder if you might consider gathering a few people tomorrow evening at the vicarage. Just the ones present at the Firelight gathering, and perhaps young Janet Roper too." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Why? Have you something to share?" "Not quite yet. But I believe the storm is about to break, and it would be wise to ensure everyone is indoors when it does." He gave her a long, searching look. You're certain? I rarely am, Inspector. But I'm confident. Shall we say 7 o'clock? The next day passed uneasily. Villagers whispered on corners, unsure if the mystery was deepening or nearing its end. The rain came at last, in short, bitter bursts, and the streets glistened beneath pale lamplight. By 7 o'clock, the vicarage drawing-room was filled, Clarissa Phillimore wan and quiet, Vera Lawton dignified and pale, Henry Cottrell, eyes darting about nervously, Janet Roper fidgeting with the buttons of her cardigan. Even Reverend Pembroke had joined them, standing with arms crossed behind his back. Miss Marple sat near the fire, knitting in her lap, spectacles low on her nose. Inspector Cray stood by the window, arms folded. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "This may seem unusual, but I find that when a room is gathered with the right minds and a little warmth from the hearth, truth has a way of creeping in uninvited." Clarissa managed a faint smile. Vera remained composed. Miss Marple continued. "We've all wondered who killed Douglas Phillimore, and more recently where Thomas Little has gone. But in truth, these questions are connected. A thread binds them if one only follows it." She looked around the room. "I don't yet ask for confessions, but I believe someone in this room has held something back, perhaps out of fear or guilt or miscalculation." She paused and looked directly at Vera. "Miss Lawton, would you be so kind as to tell us why you removed the third teacup after Miss Phillimore failed to arrive?" The room stiffened. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly. Vera blinked. "What do you mean?" "You knew she would not be joining you," Miss Marple said gently. "So you removed her teacup to make it appear as though she had never been expected, but that was not true. The housekeeper prepared 3 cups. I imagine you washed one quickly and returned it to its shelf before anyone else noticed." Vera opened her mouth, then shut it again. Clarissa stared at her. "Is that true?" I don't know what you're suggesting." Miss Marple did not press her, not yet. "I merely point out a detail. Because you see, Miss Lawton, lies often begin with something small like the concealment of a cup. But they never stay small." She rose slowly, her eyes sweeping the room. "Tomorrow I shall tell you all what I believe happened. But tonight I suggest you consider what truths you've tried to hide and whether they're worth the weight of continued silence." And with that, Miss Marple turned to the window. Outside, lightning flickered along the horizon. By morning, the rain had turned to drizzle, clinging to hedgerows and cobbles like a heavy veil. Miss Marple stood at her window, stirring a cup of tea with an absent mind. The firelight gathering had done what it must, had unsettled, disturbed, pushed 1 or 2 individuals closer to the precipice. She had not expected Vera Lawton to crack that night, nor had she required it. Fear, when stirred gently, had a way of rising to the surface like cream, and Miss Marple knew that today would bring someone to her door compelled by conscience or desperation. She was right. At 10 minutes past 9, a knock came. Not firm, but not timid either. She opened the door to find Clarissa Phillimore. On the step, bundled in a navy coat with a hood drawn over her pale face. "I need to talk," Clarissa said simply. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "Come in. The fire's on, and I've just made fresh toast." They sat in the parlor, the ticking of the mantel clock the only sound for a moment as Clarissa warmed her hands around the teacup. "It's about Douglas," she said. I know, there's something I didn't tell you." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You were in shock. No one expects perfect recall under such grief." Clarissa shook her head. "It's not memory, it was cowardice." Miss Marple waited. Clarissa set her cup down. "Douglas told me he was going to write a letter. To someone? He said he'd had enough of secrets and wanted to clear the air, as he put it. This was a week before he died." "Did he say whose secrets he meant to clear?" "No, only that they were close to home and that he couldn't stand." "The hypocrisy any more?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did you ever see this letter?" Clarissa hesitated. "No, but I found the stub of a notepad in his desk drawer after he died. The top page had been torn off. I thought nothing of it until Janet Roper said something at the vicarage. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. What did she say? She said someone warned Douglas not to send a certain letter, that there was a copy that someone knew. Indeed, Miss Marple said, and I think that someone went to considerable lengths to ensure that letter never reached its recipient. Clarissa paled. Do you think someone killed him for it? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. When truth is threatening enough, my dear, people do dreadful things to silence it. Clarissa looked down at her lap, fingers twisting in the fabric of her gloves. I love Douglas, you know. He could be infuriating, difficult, even cruel in some moods, but he had a mind that was utterly clear. And he hated lies. Miss Marple regarded her quietly. I believe you loved him, and I believe he loved you. Clarissa gave a sad smile. Funny, isn't it? I never said it aloud before. Miss Marple reached for her notepad. I wonder, Clarissa, did Douglas say anything else in that last week? Something that may have seemed trivial at the time? Clarissa frowned, searching her memory. He said something odd the day before he died. He asked me whether I knew how Vera Lawton kept her accounts. Her accounts? Clarissa nodded. I thought he meant her financial books. He was treasurer of the parish council after all. But I think he meant something else, a private ledger, maybe. Interesting, Miss Marple said quietly. Very interesting indeed. At midday, Miss Marple made her way back to High Gables. This time, Vera Lawton answered the door herself. She looked pale but composed, the only sign of strain a slight tremor in her hands as she fastened the top button of her cardigan. Miss Marple, she said with a thin smile, I gather I should have expected you. I thought we might speak a little more frankly this time, Miss Marple replied, stepping inside. Now that the shadows are thinning? Vera led her into the drawing room, where the scent of lavender and beeswax hung in the air. You suspect me, Vera said, folding her hands neatly on her lap. I suspect everyone, Miss Lawton, Miss Marple replied. It is the only safe course. Vera gave a soft, humorless laugh. Of course. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. I'm curious, Miss Lawton, what became of the third teacup? Vera's eyes narrowed. Must we go through that again? Indulge me. A pause. I put it away, Vera admitted. I didn't think it would matter. Clarissa didn't come. It seemed, silly to leave it sitting there. Yet you removed it before anyone arrived. Because you knew she wasn't coming. Vera didn't answer. Miss Marple pressed on. You knew she wouldn't come because Douglas never meant her to receive the invitation, didn't he? Now Vera turned sharply. What are you suggesting? That the invitation was a fabrication, perhaps sent by you. Perhaps copied. Vera's voice dropped to a low, defensive murmur. Douglas was reckless. You said so yourself. Always stirring things. Threatening to reveal things that were best left buried. Miss Marple regarded her carefully. What did he know about you, Miss Lawton? Silence stretched like taut. String between them. Then Vera said, with brittle pride, I have nothing to hide. Miss Marple didn't respond. She only smiled, gently, and stood. Thank you for your time. I do hope you'll come to the vicarage again tomorrow. I believe. Things will be clearer by then. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the village library. There, among the reference shelves, she found what she needed. The local almanac of charitable accounts, 3 years' worth. She sat by the window and turned pages slowly. It was in the 1936 entry that she found it, a sum of £250 marked discretionary. Housing repair, with no recipient listed. In 1937, a similar sum reappeared, this time marked under miscellaneous social aid. But in 1938, the current year, there was nothing. Miss Marple made a neat note and closed the book. When she emerged from the library, Inspector Cray was waiting. I take it tomorrow's the big day, he said. You're going to tell us everything? Yes, Miss Marple replied, buttoning her coat against the wind. Tomorrow we shall have our truth. And with it justice. Quietly done, I hope. The inspector gave her a dry smile. You're always hoping for quiet justice, Miss Marple. But somehow the village always ends up ringing with it. She chuckled. Yes, well, there's a great deal of noise in human hearts. You can't. Silence it all. They walked side by side down the lane, past the butcher's, the greengrocer's, and the silent post office. And somewhere, behind one of those quiet, respectable windows, the murderer was waiting. Morning in St. Mildred's passed like breath on glass hushed and cool, with the fog lying low across the village green. The bell from St. Christopher's tolled 9, slow and solemn, as though announcing some ancient reckoning. Miss Marple had risen early and laid out her blue tweed. It was a fabric of no particular statement, neither fashionable nor unfashionable, simply there, like herself. She believed that one should never try to impress when one meant to observe. At 10 o'clock the gathering commenced not at high gables this time, but in the vicarage parlor, a neutral ground. Reverend Roper had graciously offered the space, and Miss Marple had accepted, knowing that people felt safer when surrounded by faith and furniture. There was a certain tension in the air as the group assembled. Vera Lawton, dignified but watchful. Clarissa Phillimore, pale but composed. Janet Roper, trim and pinched, her eyes darting constantly. Dr. Forrester, courteous if uncharacteristically quiet, and Inspector Cray, leaning against the bookshelf with a notebook in his hand. Miss Marple sat near the fire, knitting resting on her lap, though the needles did not move. She surveyed the room gently. "I thought," she began with a modest smile, "we might speak plainly today. Not as an inquest or inquiry, but rather as concerned neighbors. After all, there has been quite a stir among us." Vera Lawton folded her hands. "Miss Marple, if you have something to say, say it. I think we've all grown weary of riddles." "Quite right," Miss Marple said. "Let us start, then, with faces, particularly those we wear and those we hide." There was a brief silence. The crackle of the fire punctuated it like a whisper of old secrets. "You see, Miss," Marple continued, "I have often found that people are not who they seem not because they are dishonest, but because they are afraid." "Afraid of what?" asked Dr. Forrester, leaning forward. "Of being known," she replied simply. "Of having the past seen too clearly." She turned to Janet Roper. "You knew Douglas Phillimore long before his return to St. Mildred's." "Did you not?" Janet flushed. Yes, I did. We were acquainted, briefly, years ago." Clarissa's head turned sharply, but she said nothing. "You were, in fact, engaged once, weren't you?" Miss Marple asked kindly. Janet's mouth trembled. "It was called off. He left. That was the end of it." "But not the end of your feelings, I think." Janet looked down. Miss Marple nodded. "And when he returned, you feared he might speak of it? Or worse muck you? He could be unkind in small ways, could Douglas." A silence settled again. "But it was not Janet," Miss Marple said quietly, "who was most afraid?" All eyes shifted. "No," Miss Marple said, her gaze now resting lightly on Vera. "It was you, Miss Lawton." Vera did not flinch. "Afraid of what, precisely? Of exposure? Of discovery?" "Not of anything as vulgar as crime, perhaps, but of impropriety. Of impropriety in the past." Miss Marple's voice was soft, conversational. "I believe Douglas had come across some financial irregularity in the parish accounts. Perhaps a pattern of discretionary funds being funneled to a cause unlisted." She held up a slip of paper, the Coppet account page from the library almanac. In 1936 and 1937, a sum of £250 was marked under vague categories. In 1938, it vanished entirely. Now, that may mean nothing. But it may also mean someone redirected the funds somewhere less official. Vera's hands clenched in her lap. "Why would I do such a thing?" she asked tightly. Miss Marple tilted her head. "That's the thing about motive. It's rarely financial in its origin. It's often emotional. A person might redirect money for someone they care for, someone whose name cannot be publicly linked to charity. Say, an invalid relative kept in a sanatorium, or a grown child with a habit best left unspoken. A beat." "I don't have children," Vera said. "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "But you had a sister." "The one who disappeared from parish gossip in 1924, Mary Lawton. A nervous breakdown, I believe?" Vera stared at her, lips parted. "I think Douglas discovered something about that. Or about Mary, or about where the money was going." I think. He meant to tell Clarissa or perhaps confront you directly. No, Vera whispered. He promised, he said he wouldn't, but the words caught in her throat. Miss Marple continued, more softly now, like a nurse changing a bandage. He may have promised. But Douglas, as we know, had a habit of changing his mind when his conscience pricked him, and I believe he drafted a letter. A letter that never reached its destination. Inspector Cray stepped forward. So you think Miss Lawton intercepted? It? I think someone did, Miss Marple said. And that someone also altered the place setting at the gathering to conceal that Clarissa had never been invited. Clarissa gasped. Wait, you mean I wasn't? No, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. Vera never sent you that invitation. It was sent by Douglas, or rather, meant to be. Vera saw the letter, or perhaps guessed its contents, and she removed it. Then she arranged the tea to suggest Clarissa had refused it, but she said only 2 teacups at first. The third was added later, under Inspector Cray's scrutiny. The inspector's eyes narrowed, which means someone was covering up? Not planning a murder, perhaps, but hiding a confrontation that never occurred. Vera stood suddenly. I didn't kill him, she said, voice breaking. I only wanted to stop the damage, that's all. I burned the letter. I didn't even read it, not fully, only saw enough to understand his intent. Miss Marple regarded her gently. And the third teacup? I added it the next morning. I thought if people believed Clarissa had been invited, it would divert attention. I never imagined anyone would care about the cup. Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile. People rarely do until they must. Inspector Cray cleared his throat. All very illuminating, Miss Marple. But I still don't see how this gets. Use closer to the cause of death. Miss Marple stood and smoothed her skirt. Because the cause of death was not poison, nor violence, but fright. The room stilled. I believe Douglas Fillmore suffered a heart attack, brought on by the shock of some confrontation, perhaps with Vera or someone else entirely. Are you saying he wasn't murdered? Clarissa asked, stunned. I'm saying, Miss Marple said, that we must look not for someone who meant to kill, but for someone who meant only to silence and succeeded too well. And with that she stepped away from the fire, her knitting untouched. The village of St. Mildred's, with its tidy cottages and narrow lanes, often seemed like a picture frozen in time, too neat, too polished. But Miss Marple had long known that even the most serene canvas had its empty spaces, where shadows gathered and truths slipped through the cracks. That morning the air was crisp, but the sky was heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Marple took her usual slow stroll along the high street, nodding to shopkeepers and pausing to watch the fluttering leaves tumble down the cobbles. She had a singular destination in mind, the little antique shop owned by Mr. Wilkins, a man known for his knowledge of village history and, more importantly, the silent witnesses tucked away in forgotten corners. Inside the shop, the scent of old wood and leather mingled with a faint hint of lavender. Shelves bowed under the weight of china figurines, gilded picture frames, and books with cracked spines. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Mr. Wilkins, emerging from behind a tall cabinet, his spectacles perched precariously on the tip of his nose. "Good morning, Mr. Wilkins. I wonder if I might trouble you with a question about a frame." He raised an eyebrow. "A frame, you say?" "Yes, a particular frame that once hung in High Gables." Mr. Wilkins smiled faintly. "Ah, yes, the old family portrait frame. It was removed last year after Mrs. Lawton's sister disappeared." "From the painting," Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I heard as much. What became of it?" "It's here," Wilkins said, gesturing to a shelf where a finely carved but empty frame rested against a stack of leather-bound ledgers. Miss Marple examined it carefully. The oak was intricately carved with floral motifs, and the back bore the initials VL, a beautiful piece, she murmured. "Do you know why the portrait was removed?" Wilkins shrugged. "The story goes that the portrait was damaged water stains, I believe, but some say it was taken down to hide something unsightly." Miss Marple's fingers traced the edge of the frame. "Do you have any photographs of the portrait before it was removed?" Mr. Wilkins nodded and pulled from a drawer a small album of black and white photographs. He opened it to a page showing a grand, solemn portrait of a woman seated in a chair, her eyes sharp, her expression unreadable. "That would be Mary Lawton," he said softly. "Vera's sister, long since vanished from the village." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the woman's face. "She looks very like Vera." "Indeed," Wilkins agreed, "but with a harder set to the jaw. Some said she had secrets." "And what became of Mary?" Miss Marple asked. "After a scandal involving a broken engagement and rumors of mental illness, she left the village quietly. No one saw her again." Miss Marple's mind pieced the fragments together: Vera's guarded demeanor, the missing letter, the redirection of funds. The past had a way of reaching forward like a hand grasping at shadows. She thanked Mr. Wilkins and stepped back out into the street, the empty frame still vivid in her mind. Later that day, Miss Marple was summoned unexpectedly to the vicarage. Janet Roper was waiting, her face pale and drawn, clutching a bundle of papers. "I found these in my father's study," Janet said, handing over the papers. "I didn't want to tell anyone, but I think they might be important." Miss Marple unfolded the pages carefully. They were old ledger sheets, listing donations and payments with cryptic annotations in the margins. "There are entries here matching the sums I found in the almanac," Miss Marple murmured. "But these show payments to a Mrs. Evelyn Clark." "Who is she?" Janet asked. Miss Marple looked up. "That is the key, my dear. Mrs. Clark was a widow who lived in the village some years ago. No one speaks of her much now." Janet frowned. "Why would Vera Lawton send money to her? Is she connected to Vera's sister?" "It seems likely," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps Mrs. Clark was a confidant or a keeper of secrets?" Janet looked troubled. "I don't understand why anyone would want to hide this." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because the truth, once uncovered, can disrupt more than just a village ledger. It can unsettle reputations, unmask guilt, and reveal betrayals. That evening the village was alive with whispers. News of Miss Marple's inquiries had spread, and the air was thick with anticipation. Miss Marple sat in her armchair by the fire, her knitting now a mere prop, as she sorted through her thoughts. She knew the truth was closer than anyone imagined. The missing letter, the empty frame, the redirected funds, they were all pieces of a puzzle shaped by fear, love, and desperation. She had a name in mind, but the final confirmation would come only with patience and careful observation. For now she would wait and watch. The late afternoon sun struggled through a lattice of dull gray clouds as Miss Marple made her way along the lane toward the Roper household. The village felt unusually still, as if the very air waited, tense and expectant. Word had spread that Miss Marple wished to speak again with Janet Roper, and whispers followed her footsteps like shadows. The vicarage garden was neatly kept, the rose bush pruned but barren of blooms in the early autumn chill. Janet was standing by the window, fingers pressed against the glass as if to hold back the cold or perhaps the past. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," Janet said, voice low. "I wanted to speak before the evening gathering." Miss Marple smiled gently. "There is much to say, Janet, and little time to say it in. But I thought you might find it easier here." Janet's eyes flicked toward the empty seat opposite her. "Please," she urged softly. Janet sank down and took a deep breath, gathering herself like a child preparing for a lesson. "I've carried a secret for too long," she began. Douglas Fillimore and we were engaged once, yes. But it ended badly." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her to continue. "We parted because he wanted more than I could give. He wanted a life filled with adventures and change. I wanted stability and roots. It wasn't just a matter of temperament, it was deeper, something I didn't understand then." "What might that have been?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Janet's fingers twisted the edge of her handkerchief. "I think now he was searching for someone who could never be found." Miss Marple folded her knitting, eyes steady. "And when he returned to St. Mildred's, he was not the man I remembered." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Not at all." Janet swallowed hard. "I heard about the letter, about the threats. To silence him, I was frightened, but I kept quiet." "And why was that?" Miss Marple asked gently. Because I thought he might be dangerous. Not physically, but in the damage he could do if he spoke. There were things he knew. Things connected to Vera Lawton's family. Things about her sister. Miss Marple's expression softened. He told me once that Mary Lawton had been a troubled soul, yes, but that she had been driven to desperate measures. That the money Vera redirected was meant to protect her. Protect? Miss Marple repeated. Janet nodded. From scandal. From ruin, but it meant hiding the truth. Do you know what this desperate measure was? Miss Marple inquired. Janet hesitated, then whispered, Mary. Mary was not ill in the way people said. She had been involved in an affaire liaison with a man who was never named. When her father found out, he threatened to disown her. Miss Marple listened closely. She left the village to avoid disgrace, but the shame lingered. Vera tried to keep it quiet by redirecting funds to help her sister's living expenses. A heavy silence fell. But Douglas discovered this, Janet went on. He thought the villagers had a right to know. He wanted to write that letter to clear his conscience. But Vera feared the damage it would do not just to her, but to the village's reputation. Miss Marple nodded. Which is why she removed the third teacup, to erase your invitation and the knowledge you might bring. Janet looked away. I wasn't invited because Vera feared I would speak out. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And yet you came. Yes, Janet whispered, because I wanted to see him one last time, to tell him I forgave him. Miss Marple reached out and took Janet's hand. Forgiveness is a kind gift. And now, I believe, the time has come for truth. That evening, the vicarage parlor was filled once more. The fire burned brightly, casting flickering shadows on the walls lined with books and framed photographs. Vera Lawton sat in her usual chair, her composure as steady as ever, but the tension was visible beneath her calm exterior. Clarissa Phillimore was present, pale but composed. Janet Roper sat near the window, hands folded tightly. Miss Marple stood near the hearth, her eyes sweeping the room with quiet certainty. Tonight, she began, we have heard much. Of secrets kept, letters hidden, and hearts burdened. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I believe the truth is not a single event, but a chain each link forged by fear, love, and desperation. She turned to Vera. You feared the past would destroy you, so you burned the letter. To protect your sister's memory. To protect the village. To protect yourself. Vera's eyes glistened. Yes, but I never meant to harm Douglas. Only to stop the gossip. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet the consequences were tragic. She turned to Clarissa. You too were caught in the web. Invited, then uninvited, your place erased to hide the truth. Clarissa swallowed. I understand now. I was a pawn, not a player, Janet spoke softly. Douglas's heart gave, out before the truth could come. But his spirit demanded justice. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Indeed it does. Inspector Cray stepped forward. We have no murder weapon, no poison, no violent act. Yet we have a death that was no accident, Miss Marple nodded. Fright. The shock of betrayal, of confrontation, can be a killer in its own right. She looked around at the gathered faces, each shadowed with their own guilt and grief. But I believe that now, with these truths laid bare, we may find peace. The room was silent. Miss Marple smiled gently. Tomorrow we will gather once more. The final pieces will fall into place. The village woke to a muted dawn. The sky streaked with soft hues of pink and gray as the first light touched the rooftops of St. Mildred's. The tranquility, however, was deceptive, a thin veil stretched over taut nerves and quiet anticipation. The mystery that had unsettled the village for weeks was drawing inexorably toward its climax. Miss Marple, as always, rose early. Her routine remained unchanged. A pot of tea, a slice of toast, and quiet reflection by the window. Today, though, her thoughts were sharper, her observations keener. The pieces were almost all in place, but one final thread was yet to be tugged. By mid-morning, Miss Marple was once again at High Gables. The manor, grand yet softened by time, held its usual stillness, but with an undercurrent of expectancy. Vera Lawton was in the garden, tending to a bed of chrysanthemums with deliberate care, her expression guarded but resolute. "Good morning, Vera," Miss Marple said gently as she approached. Vera looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting you so early." "There are matters best settled before the day grows old," Miss Marple replied kindly. Vera wiped her hands on her apron and gestured toward a wrought iron bench beneath the apple tree. They sat down, the air crisp and carrying the scent of earth and fading blooms. "You've been very patient through all this," Miss Marple began. "And quite brave, too," Vera's eyes clouded. "Bravery is a poor defense when suspicion surrounds you." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, but courage and truth often walk hand in hand." For a moment silence settled between them. "Vera," Miss Marple continued carefully, "we have spoken of the letter, the missing teacup, and the redirected funds. But there is one thing that troubles me still." Vera's gaze sharpened. "What is that?" "The nature of your relationship with Mary, more specifically, what happened to her after she left St. Mildred's." Vera's lips tightened. "I have told you all I know," Miss Marple inclined her head. "Perhaps. But I wonder if you have told yourself." "The whole truth." Vera's breath caught. "I loved my sister." "Despite everything, I loved her." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "love does not always prevent secrets. Sometimes it forces them." Vera looked away, voice barely a whisper. "Mary was ill. Not just in mind, but in spirit. She disappeared because she was afraid of what would happen if the truth came out." "Fear," Miss Marple mused. "A powerful motive for silence." Meanwhile, at the village hall, Inspector Cray convened a meeting with the remaining villagers. The room was filled with the quiet murmur of voices, punctuated by occasional coughs and the shuffle of feet. Clarissa Phillimore sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Janet Roper was beside her, serene yet tense. The others' friends and neighbors alike watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple entered quietly and took a place near the side, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," Inspector Cray began. "We are here to clarify the facts surrounding Douglas Phillimore's untimely death." He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. "While there is no evidence of foul play in the traditional sense, the circumstances are complex. Some details remain unclear, but we trust that, with continued cooperation, the truth will emerge." Miss Marple stood and stepped forward, her presence commanding yet gentle. "If I may," she said, voice steady. "Truth, like a tapestry, is woven from many threads, some bright, some dark. We have uncovered much in recent days, secrets, fears, and misunderstandings." She paused to meet several pairs of eyes. "But the final thread that holds the fabric together is the one that must be revealed tonight." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple gathered the key figures at High Gables once more. The room was charged with a nervous energy anticipation mingled with unease. She began by recounting the facts as she understood them, carefully and without accusation. Douglas Phillimore was a man burdened by conscience. He sought to reveal a truth that could have shaken the foundations of our village. His letter, though never sent, was a beacon of that intent. She glanced at Vera, who met her gaze without flinching. The third teacup, removed and replaced, was a symbol of a secret invitation, an attempt to conceal who was to be included and who was to be excluded. Clarissa nodded slowly. Miss Marple continued. "The redirection of parish funds was meant to protect a vulnerable member of our community, Mary Lawton. But the protection came at a cost, silence and shadows where light should have been." Janet shifted in her seat. "And Douglas's death?" "Not murder, but shock." The heart, burdened by betrayal and fear, gave out. The room fell silent. As the firelight flickered in the hearth, Miss Marple's eyes rested on each face in turn. "But there is one last question," she said. "Who, among us, felt compelled to burn the letter? To attempt to erase the past rather than confront it?" A heavy silence followed. Then Vera spoke, voice steady but soft. "I did. I feared the ruin it would bring, not just to myself, but to those I loved." "And that fear," Miss Marple said gently, "is a heavy burden indeed." She looked around once more. But now, with the truth laid bare, we may begin to heal. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and steady, washing away the dust of suspicion and regret. Miss Marple felt the familiar calm settle. Over her, the final thread had been found. Soon, all would be clear. Evening crept over St. Mildred's with a muted grace, the air rich with wood smoke and damp leaves. At High Gables, a fire was once again crackling in the hearth, casting amber shadows across the paneled drawing room. This was where it had all begun, the gathering, the third teacup, the fatal collapse. And now, the final answers would be drawn out like threads from a worn tapestry. Miss Marple, seated in her usual chair near the fire, looked out at the small circle that had been drawn together once more. Clarissa Phillimore, dignified but visibly pale, sat upright with folded hands. Vera Lawton leaned slightly forward, her eyes shadowed. Janet Roper perched quietly by the French window, still as a statue. Inspector Cray stood beside the mantel, arms crossed, clearly waiting for Miss Marple to speak. A final silence settled over the room. "It's never easy," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and even, "to face the truth of what one's friends or family are capable of. But if we shy away from it, we remain tangled in shadows." Clarissa opened her mouth but said nothing. Miss Marple turned toward her. "You were in this room the night your husband died. You saw the third teacup, the one meant to signal a private conversation with Vera. But it wasn't meant for Vera at all, was it?" Clarissa's brow furrowed. I thought it was... No, it was always meant for someone else. Someone whose presence that night was secret, hidden even from you. Because someone had invited her here quietly before anyone arrived. The room held its breath. Janet Roper finally stirred. "You mean Mary?" Miss Marple nodded gently. Mary Lawton had returned to St. Mildred's, quietly, under another name. And someone who knew her true identity met her here that night. A long pause. Clarissa blinked rapidly. "But who would—" "It was you, Janet," Miss Marple said, turning her full attention on the vicar's assistant. Janet looked stunned, but not surprised. She drew in a slow breath. "You invited Mary because she had reached out to you. Confided in you, perhaps, in a moment of desperation. She was your childhood friend, wasn't she?" Janet gave a small nod. "We were friends long ago. I hadn't heard from her in years. Then, a few weeks ago, I received a letter. She was back in England. She wanted to talk." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. "And so, you suggested she come here, secretly, that you'd ensure she had a chance to speak with Douglas before anything became public." "I did, Janet," said her voice low. She had made peace with her past, she said. She wanted to clear the air. Clear the air. She wasn't well, Miss Marple, fragile but lucid. She believed she could explain everything. "And you arranged for her to come to High Gables before the Firelight gathering began. That's why the third teacup was set early." "And why?" "The cup disappeared before the others arrived?" Inspector Cray's brow creased. "So she was here before Douglas died?" "She was," Janet said, "but she didn't kill him. She never intended to harm him. She came hoping for reconciliation." Miss Marple gave a small nod, but Douglas was not ready for peace. He was afraid of scandal, of retribution, perhaps even of love he couldn't admit. He was ashamed. When he saw her, the shock, the confrontation, overwhelmed him. His heart gave out. Clarissa's face had gone pale. "Then, he saw her before he died? My husband, he knew Mary had returned?" "I believe he did," Miss Marple said gently. "And he collapsed shortly after. The third teacup was never used because she fled?" Janet ushered her out quietly while the others were distracted by the commotion. She vanished again, not out of guilt but fear. Vera let out a slow breath. "So, she didn't poison him. There was no murder." "No poison," Miss Marple agreed. "But fear can be just as deadly. The fear Douglas carried of a truth long buried, and the consequences of it was what truly undid him." Janet looked down at her hands. "I burned the letter. The one he had written to you, Clarissa. Mary asked me to. She thought it would hurt you more than help. She believed Douglas regretted writing it." Miss Marple studied her. "Perhaps. But we must be careful not to protect people from pain at the cost of truth. Pain can pass. Secrets corrode. The fire cracked again in the hearth. The room felt heavier now, not from dread, but from clarity. Clarissa wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. He died with so many things unsaid? Many people do, Miss Marple replied kindly. But that doesn't mean we must carry their silence forever. Inspector Cray stepped forward. So there was no crime, no foul play, only misunderstandings, fears, and a past that refused to stay buried. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Indeed, though perhaps it's a lesson not every death requires a villain, but every life deserves truth. There was a pause, and then Clarissa stood, her posture more fragile than before. I would like to find her, she said quietly. Mary, if she is out there, I suspect she won't be far, Miss Marple said. Not now. The days that followed were quiet in St. Mildred's. The rumors dwindled into silence. The village returning to its rhythms of gardening, church bells, and market days. Mary Lawton's presence, though no longer officially noted, hovered like a faint perfume from the past. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and took once more to her knitting. The final scarf was almost finished. She often said that, solving a mystery was like turning over compost. Unpleasant work, but necessary for anything new to grow. As she added the final stitches, she looked out her window at the lanes of the village she knew so well. People waved, children chased dogs. Somewhere, a kettle whistled. People are very much alike, she murmured, but their secrets are always different. She sipped her tea and glanced at the teacups on her tray. There were two, no third cup, not today. The end.